Okay, folks, good morning. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Good to have everyone here. I'll introduce the committee members that are here today. Deputy Chair Colleen Young, Mr. Hugh Nerline, Mr. Todd Gowdy, Mr. Marv Friesen, and Mr. Dana Skoropad. Chitting in for Ms. Alina Young is Ms. Erica Ritchie. I'd like to welcome and introduce welcome our Provincial Comptroller, Mr. Terry Payton, to the committee here today. I'd like to welcome and introduce our Provincial Auditor, Tara Clement, Kim Lowe, and officials that will be with us here today from the Provincial Auditor's Office. This time I'll table the following documents. PAC 4529, Ministry of Advanced Education, Report of Public Losses, October 1st to December 31st, 2021. PAC 4629, Ministry of Health, Report of Public Losses, October 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2021. PAC 4729, Ministry of Finance, Report of Public Losses, October 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2021. I'd like to, I guess we're focusing this morning on the Saskatchewan Health Authority and this afternoon as well. Thank you so much to Deputy Minister Hendricks for being here, officials with the Ministry of Health and leadership of the Saskatchewan Health Authority for your time here today. I will ask Mr. Hendricks to just briefly introduce the officials that are here today. And then we'll save any other opening remarks or response until we've had the presentation from the Provincial Auditor. But if you can introduce officials, Deputy Minister Hendricks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Seated to my right is Assistant Deputy Minister Mark Wyatt. And to my left is Robbie Peters, Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Also with us is Billy Joe Moore. I'll have them raise their hand. They're behind me. Billy Joe Morissette, Assistant Deputy Minister. Melanie Demarney, who is the Director of Operations and Internal Audit with the Ministry. As well, we have Andrew Will, Interim Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Corey Miller, Vice President, Provincial Programs. Beth Vachon, Vice President, Quality, Safety and Strategy. Andrew McClutchy, Integrated Northern Health. Sharon Garrett, Vice President, Integrated Urban Health and Chief Nursing Officer. Karen Earnshaw, Vice President, Integrated Rural Health. And Kyle Matthews, who's the Executive Director of Organizational Development and Employee Wellness.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you to the officials that are here today, and thank you to all the other officials that are and those in health that are connected to the work that we're going to be talking about today and that have been involved in these presentations. I'm going to table the document PAC 4829, Saskatchewan Health Authority Status Update, dated March 1st, 2021. Thanks to the folks as well that were involved in putting that together. It really helps us focus our work here at this committee, so thank you for that. At this time, I am going to turn it over to our Provincial Auditor's Office, to our Provincial Auditor, and I understand we're going to be focusing on a grouping of 4 chapters that are all related here to start. I'll turn it over to Provincial Auditor Clement.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members, and other officials. With me today is Ms. Kim Lowe. Kim participates in the annual integrated audit of the Saskatchewan Health Authority and was responsible for leading a number of the performance audits that we are going to go through today. So this morning, Kim's going to present the chapters in the order that they do appear on the agenda before you. This will result in 17 presentations, so there is certain chapters that we have combined together into one presentation. So for example, as indicated, the first 4 chapters have been combined into one presentation. Kim is going to pause for the committee's consideration after each presentation. There are 5 presentations that do include a total of 33 new audit recommendations for the committee's consideration. And before I do turn it over to Kim, I do just want to thank the interim CEO of the Saskatchewan Health Authority and all the officials at the Saskatchewan Health Authority that do assist us during the course of our work, and especially during the pandemic. With that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thanks. The first 4 chapters on this morning's agenda include the results of our annual integrated audits of the Saskatchewan Health Authority for the years ended March 31st, 2018 to March 31st, 2021. This includes the results of our first annual audit of the authority following amalgamation of the 12 former regional health authorities for the year ended March 31st, 2018. These chapters include 4 new recommendations for the committee's consideration. 1 was new in our 2018 report, Volume 2, and 3 were new in our 2019 report, Volume 2. For each of the 4 fiscal years described in these chapters, we found the authority had reliable financial statements and complied with the authorities governing its activities. In addition, the authority had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources, except the 4 areas highlighted in our recommendations. On page 79 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, we recommended the Saskatchewan Health Authority sign an adequate service level agreement with eHealth Saskatchewan to enable monitoring of the quality and timeliness of eHealth provision of IT services. This recommendation remained outstanding at March 2021. The authority moved the majority of its IT systems into eHealth's data center in 2017-18 and signed an operating agreement with eHealth in 2017. We find the agreement inadequate in allowing for appropriate monitoring of IT services. For example, the agreement does not include provisions about IT change processes, service levels, for example, response times, system availability, security requirements, and disaster recovery. We also found eHealth had not completed or tested its disaster recovery plans for certain critical IT systems and data of the authority, for example, lab system, hospital admission system. Having an inadequate service level agreement increases the risk of the authority not effectively monitoring whether eHealth meets the authority's IT needs. Furthermore, not having completed or tested disaster recovery plans for critical IT systems increases the risk the authority may be unable to restore within a reasonable time its critical IT systems and data in the event of a disaster. On page 82 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, we recommended the Saskatchewan Health Authority implement an improved code of conduct policy, including permitted vendor-sponsored travel. This recommendation is now implemented. By December 2019, we found the authority implemented a conflict of interest policy, including sufficient details on permitted vendor-sponsored travel. The policy requires managerial and practitioner staff in leadership positions to complete an annual conflict of interest disclosure form. In addition, the policy requires the Chief Executive Officer or respective executive leadership team member to pre-approve vendor-sponsored travel. For 10 staff we tested who were required to complete the annual form, each had signed forms on file. Also, for 3 instances of approved vendor-sponsored travel we tested, the Chief Executive Officer or executive team member approved travel consistent with the policy. On page 84 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, we recommended the Saskatchewan Health Authority documents its due diligence procedures used to validate suppliers before adding them into its financial system. This recommendation is now implemented. The authority implemented a new process in September 2019 to validate suppliers before adding them into its financial system. It requires staff to research and document the validity of a new vendor or change supplier information before making a purchase. For 4 new or changed suppliers we tested, documentation showed staff completed due diligence procedures as expected. On page 86 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, we recommended the Saskatchewan Health Authority separate incompatible duties. This recommendation remained outstanding at March 2021. While the authority made some improvements during 2020-21 in relation to the segregation of incompatible duties, our testing continued to identify incompatible duties. The authority inadequately segregates incompatible duties related to paying suppliers, paying staff, and using journal entries to record financial transactions. For examples of specific situations we found include not restricting certain staff from entering new suppliers in the financial system and approving invoices for payment, and not restricting certain staff from being able to approve their own pay increments in the payroll system. Inadequately separating incompatible duties increases the risk of not catching errors or identifying situations where staff did not follow expected processes. Not involving more than one individual in making purchases, paying employees, and processing journal entries increases risks of undetected fraud. Finally, on pages 80 and 81 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, along with pages 86 and 87 of our 2019 report, Volume 2, we summarize the status of 11 recommendations previously agreed to by this committee in relation to integrated audits at the 12 former regional health authorities. Overall, by March 2019, we found the authority implemented 6 of these recommendations, and the 5 remaining were replaced with by the new recommendation around the authority's need to sign an adequate service level agreement with eHealth Saskatchewan for the provision of IT services. I will now pause for the committee's consideration.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the focus of the work. I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Hendricks and officials to respond, then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So first off, with the auditor's recommendation on page 80, we recommend that the Saskatchewan Health Authority sign an adequate service level agreement with eHealth Saskatchewan to enable monitoring and quality and timeliness of eHealth's provision of IT services. As the auditor noted, we view that this is partially implemented. The SHA is collaborating with eHealth Saskatchewan on the development of an information technology services agreement. The agreement will be drafted, reviewed, and approved in a staged approach as corresponding supporting schedules are completed. With respect to the second recommendation on page 82, we recommend that the Saskatchewan Health Authority implement an approved code of conduct, including permitted vendor-sponsored travel. As the auditor noted, this is implemented now. It was implemented in 2022. The provincial auditor has noted this, and so the SHA has approved and implemented a conflict of interest policy in December 2019 as well, which includes sufficient details on permitted vendor-sponsored travel. The third recommendation on page 84, we recommend that the Saskatchewan Health Authority document its due diligence to procedures used to validate suppliers before adding them into its financial system. Again, this is implemented. In September 2019, the SHA implemented a new process for setting up and changing supplier information in its financial system. Staff are required to research, document and document the validity of a new vendor or change supplier information before making a purchase. On the fourth recommendation, on page 86, we recommend that the Saskatchewan Health Authority separate incompatible duties. This recommendation is partially implemented, as the auditor noted. Our view is that this recommendation will be fully addressed with the implementation of the new Administrative Information Management System, or AIMS, in 2022.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation and for all the work on these fronts. I'll open it up to committee members at this point for questions. I see Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both to the auditor and her staff for their presentation, and to Deputy Minister of Health, Mr. Hendricks, and staff for your presentation here this morning and being available to take our questions here this morning. I do want to just ask your patience and your indulgence with these questions. I am filling in for a sick colleague and on the fly. But we are prepared with some questions, and I do want to get into those. But if there's, Mr. Chair, if there's any procedural irregularities. I just ask for your, your patience. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. But so with that, maybe we'll begin. And I guess so this will maybe go a little bit slow, but anyways, I want to focus on some questions related to some of the items here that are in that sort of partial implementation phase as you've outlined. I understand that the service level agreement has been in development for quite some time. You've indicated a staged approach and a timeline for completion. And I would maybe first of all, if I'm able to ask the auditor a question first in terms of, I think you've highlighted some of the risks associated with that agreement not being in place, and I'm wondering if we could go over that a little bit in terms of the risk that this places SaskHealth in.
Sure. So with any sort of IT service provider arrangement, you always want very much it clear in terms of roles and responsibilities in terms of what is each party responsible for. Obviously, from that IT security perspective, it needs to be very clear who's responsible for securing the various systems and data, who's paying for those costs. So from an IT perspective, often things become out of date, I guess, and if not properly maintained or not secured, are then, I guess, really at risk to vulnerabilities. So it is a matter of making sure you're clear in terms of who's going to be securing those systems, how are you aware that that is taking place, and then another area we articulate is obviously from that disaster recovery side in terms of the health sector is very much supported by the use of a number of IT systems in the delivery of operations. So it is a matter of who's going to be responsible for recovering those systems in the event of a disaster, how quickly are they going to come back up. As such, again, who's paying for that, who's testing that, and is it confirmed it is going to work as, I guess, agreed to.
Thank you for that response. So in terms of the outstanding steps that your ministry is undertaking to complete the work, I'd like to get some more detail in terms of how you plan to go about that staged approach. What are those various elements as you're doing that? And you've indicated a 22-23 timeline and how you intend to meet that target.
Thank you. So, first of all, and I don't want to use this excuse a lot today, but it's true in some cases. The work on this obviously was impacted by the pandemic and people kind of having to shift their work to other places. Nevertheless, we do agree with the auditor that a service level agreement is very important for the reasons that you've outlined as well. There is an IT services consolidation steering committee that resumed meetings at the end of June 2021, and they've established a new project plan in collaboration with a newly engaged project management team. The project plan, they've broken it down into 8 work streams that they feel will be critical components to the information technology service agreement, including project governance and management, current state validation, staff transfer, contracts, assets and expenditures, a service catalog, partnership governance and management, different, future state, business and financial model, and the information technology and service agreement. Each work stream has key activities and responsibilities that is responsible for achieving. And as we noted, the SHA and eHealth plan on having that done by 22-23. All the work groups have been organized and have started meetings to define timelines. Co-leads for each work stream have been established. Team members, detailed work plans are being developed. And participants from eHealth, SHA, and the Ministry of Health have all been identified to support each work stream. The Information Technology Service Agreement will be drafted, reviewed, and approved in a staged approach, as I noted, as corresponding work streams and schedules are completed. And so we do plan. The work is in process. We've established the process by which we'll complete that work, and we're confident it will be complete in this fiscal year, or in the next fiscal year.
Okay. I'm wondering if that also includes a contingency plan. What sort of barriers maybe have been anticipated that could take that off track?
I'll start, and then maybe if Robbie can add. Like one of the objectives that I mentioned was staff transfer. So we're transferring staff from the SHA to eHealth. Obviously, this requires discussions and negotiations with unions. That, again, has been stalled, but we're going to be picking up that work. You know, while you may have plans, timelines, that sort of thing, to actually achieve those agreements, they don't always happen according to plans. So there are certain elements of this that, you know, are potential, I guess, or potentially have the opportunity to disrupt the flow of the progress. But, you know, I think that would be one of the chief ones.
I think maybe, as Max already alluded to, depending on how COVID continues, if there's another wave or a surge, that could obviously impact us. I think the big thing for us is capacity of our staff on both the eHealth side and the SHA side. We've got a lot of different initiatives. You know, we're transferring extended care, long-term care homes into the SHA. So we got a lot of the same people and leaders that are working on these types of initiatives. So it's there's a bit of a capacity challenge on some of these. So I can see that being a potential barrier too, but I think we are in a good spot in terms of the service agreement, and we do have a good draft in place, and we actually have some workshops happening today and tomorrow to continue that. So I think we're in a good spot and able to proceed with that, and I think we got the right people and commitment on that part of it. But as Max said, it will be in stages. There's about 27 different schedules attached to that main agreement, and we've identified the core key ones that need to be in place when the main agreement goes in place. But after that, there'll be a stage approach in terms of the rest of those schedules.
And so, given those factors that you've just identified, obviously COVID has been a disruption to many ministries, and obviously not the least of which would be health. But so I appreciate that. However, obviously the work needs to continue on, and I'm just wondering if there's a contingency plan or a risk assessment, how with those risks that we've just talked about, are those part of the plan, and do you have mitigation measures identified? Or just wondering about sort of the level of contingency planning that's happened in case those kinds of things get in the way of meeting the timeline that you've set for yourselves.
Oops, sorry.
The seat here. Any other officials that are coming forward, just if you can introduce just say your name first and then proceed with your comments.
Well, Thanks for that question. A couple things I think that are giving us confidence that this will move along is eHealth and the Saskatchewan Health Authority have jointly engaged MLT Aikens to help provide support to preparing those agreements. We've also engaged with some project management support from a company called Jevity, and I think they're now Accenture. They've been acquired by Accenture. That's provided quite a bit of support in ensuring that we have momentum going forward. And as Robbie explained, part of the approach will be this phased development of the agreement. We believe we're on track to have the initial base agreement in place by the end of this month. So that will be a good step forward. And I think the heavy lifting will be in areas like the financial model and some of the service levels that will be defined in the agreement. eHealth has done about 70% of the work on the service levels, so we've made good progress even through COVID in advancing this work. So I'm feeling it's in a good place to be completed within this next fiscal year for sure.
But to the question of risk management, can you speak to how that has been worked into the plan?
So the other piece of work that we've done together with eHealth and other partners is put in place a governance structure that provides oversight to the work that's happening with eHealth and the services that they provide. So it includes, both some committees that look specifically at technology, but also at our programmatic needs. And we have, sort of experts from both organizations on those committees. And then we have an IAC committee overseeing that from a partnership perspective. And then ultimately that flows up to the DM CEO table as well, if decisions are required. And we're still developing our maturity of being able to do that, but it has started, and we have continued to meet as a committee through COVID.
And I think maybe this might be a question to sort of fill in my own knowledge gaps, but I'm wondering if you could just provide me with a little bit of a timeline for since project initiation up to this point, because from what little I know, I understand that this was initiated quite some time ago, but from your response, it sounds like you're really it sounds like project initiation. I could be mistaken, but I'm just wondering what's been kind of happening between the start and now, and how you got to this point.
Go ahead.
I can.
Yeah, so maybe I can start. And so really this was initiated when the Health Authority was created. And so when best practices is that, first let me step back and say when the Health Authority was created, eHealth was given responsibility for all provincial IT services. And so with that, best practice would sort of dictate that when you have a relationship of this nature between organizations like the Saskatchewan Health Authority and eHealth, that you have a service level agreement, as the auditor outlined, that defines expectations, deliverables, services that are going to be provided, who's responsible for what, governance, all of these things. And with that, and with the creation of the SHA, it was also determined that there would be staff transferred, information technology. They were part of the former health regions that kind of folded into the SHA and would go to eHealth and be responsible, and eHealth would be responsible for those employees and overall management of IT. Now, as a service delivery agent, eHealth has a critical function in supporting SHA services, its clinical flows, its administrative flows, that sort of thing. So, this type of agreement is really important. So work began shortly after the creation of the SHA in 2017, and I think it's fair to say we did encounter some challenges on a few things, including the transfer of staff. And then, very shortly after that, as, work was starting to pick up and progress, we kind of hit the pandemic. And then, the other element of this, and you'll hear about this on the fourth recommendation, is we can currently have this AIMS project going on, which is drawing on many of the senior leaders and staff that would be required for this project. And so I think just given this culmination of events, we've seen a delay in this project, but never, I think there's a strong recognition by Andrew, myself, and eHealth that this is a critical agreement, and we are committed to getting it done as soon as possible.
Thank you for that response. Yeah, I appreciate that that this is a Herculean task with many considerations. You mentioned the staff transfers, et cetera, and the AIMS project. So, I mean, where was, I don't want to have to necessarily go over the past, but just in the just to really sort of understand what's going on here, maybe I will ask, in terms of like, obviously you had many priorities or undertakings, I'll just call them that, in terms of that amalgamation. There's many things that you have to undertake when you're making a merger of this sort and a transition. And just wondering sort of how this particular component of the merger, I don't know if that's the right word to call it, but pardon me, how this was seen and the importance or priority that it had as you were doing these other things. Like, maybe you can help me understand the bigger picture when you talk about the AIMS project and all the various moving parts as this agreement was being put into place.
So obviously, when the health authority was created, there were a number of pretty significant I guess work streams that were underway at that time. And I think when we with these sort of things which kind of fall out of that amalgamation process, they do have attached a high level of importance to them. Similarly though, projects like AIMS, and there was, even within the SHA, organizing its organizational structure and how it was managed and its governance. There were several work streams going on concurrently, which I think during a regular time or regular period would have been manageable. But I think, obviously there were some challenges to that, where people that were working on these things have been pulled into other areas. And so, I guess there was an assessment made that, the combination of all of these tasks was, something that could be managed by the system. But I will acknowledge that it didn't leave a lot of room for an unforeseen event. And so some of these things have been delayed. At the end of the day, the SHA, the eHealth does provide support for almost 30,000, users within the SHA, 40,000 users within the SHA, thousands of clinical systems, all of our PACs, our digital imaging, lab systems, all of this, it provides all of that, and that's working, and pretty well most of the time. And so, the absence of the agreement hasn't stopped what is existing, but the problem is that the relationship hasn't been formalized, and some of the accountabilities haven't been formalized, and so that's the challenge. It's kind of like there's a gentleman's agreement right now, and that's maybe not good enough in this situation.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying. And I, I acknowledge and recognize that the audit is identifying risks and things that, formally need to be established in order to ensure that, the system is robust and protected from any kinds of errors and, heaven forbid, fraud and those sorts of things. And I appreciate that's what you're endeavoring to do here. I would say, though, that I would only make the observation, and it might be just because I'm just seeing this for the first time, but it does appear to me that there was a fair amount of time before the pandemic occurred in which to put in place the work plan and the governance structure. And so a bit concerned there, appreciating the challenges, but just only making that point. And maybe I'll move along. Thank you also very much for the responses to that question on that new recommendation. And I will move on to the new recommendation number 4, where, oh yes, okay, well this is good because I had a question about AIMS. I didn't really know what that was. So the new recommendation is for Health Authority to separate out incompatible duties, and I guess I would start by if you could provide me with a bit of a general overview of what AIMS is, and then we'll kind of go from there.
So AIMS is a project that is to replace all of our back office or administrative systems. So it's our finance systems, it's our, which includes our payment systems, our collections, billings, our general ledger reporting. It's also our payroll systems, our scheduling systems, HR systems, supply chain, purchasing, inventory. So all those different systems, we continue to operate the former 12 region systems. So right now, in finance, I run 12 separate finance systems, and to produce a SHA report, we have to consolidate all that information. So obviously it's not efficient and you don't get the best information from that. So it is a project to replace all those systems with one single solution. And the solution that we're implementing will also integrate those various systems. So finance will integrate with payroll, supply chain, and so on. So that's basically what the project is.
Okay, and so in this case here, I guess what I'm wondering is, in the current situation, is there a certain what sort of challenges are you facing right now with some of those incompatible functions?
In terms of the segregation of duties, I think some of the challenges are some of the old systems won't allow us to automate some of our controls or separate, using a roles-based security approach within the system. So I think that's one of our challenges. Obviously, having 12 different systems, we have 12 different processes. We have former regional staff's leadership that we still rely on to run those systems. We've had a lot of turnover over the last 4 years. We've lost a lot of leadership. So I think those are some of our concerns and risks as well in terms of keeping those legacy systems operating effectively and doing what we need to do from them. I think those are some of the bigger things. And then I think just, as we move from regional-based kind of processes to provincial, whether it's policies, work standard, or whatever, it's not as easy to implement those province-wide when you have, those disparate systems or processes. So one of the things we try to do is if we are implementing provincial policies, we have a compliance checklist now where our accounting or our finance team does a bi-weekly check-in to make sure that leaders in the former regions are following those new policies or the provincial based, and there's no issues with them. So we are trying to, even though we don't have the single system in place, we are trying to mitigate some of those challenges or gaps as we go.
So you mentioned some turnover and loss of leadership. Can you tell me a little bit more about like that? Was it how many or what positions? How that's been addressed?
I don't have numbers in terms of how many, but I can say it's fairly significant. When we amalgamated, we still, we put in the provincial-based, obviously, leadership structure at the VP and executive director level fairly quickly, and then started moving down to director, and we just implemented managers within the last year. So it's been a bit of a time taken to implement our full org structure, which is still not complete in terms of all of our out-of-scope positions, meaning our non-unionized positions, so specialists and those that report to managers. So we're still working through that, but what we did initially is we recognized that because we need to still operate all of these different systems, we still need that former leadership in those areas. So we came up with attrition plans in terms of, if someone didn't fit into one of those layers of management that were being rolled out, we would look to still keep them in terms of being able to help operationalize the systems that we had. So that was one thing we did in terms of trying to make sure we still had that experience and knowledge there. But as those people left, we've struggled in terms of filling that knowledge gap. We've had to put in temporary positions in a number of different places, which presents its own challenges in terms of retaining people when they don't see their full-time opportunities coming very quickly. But it's been a very challenging environment, but I think we've managed it quite well. We've got strong leadership in our accounting finance area, and they've been able to manage so far.
Yeah, well, I can see how this kind of a structural change could be, made more challenging by loss of employees, and depending on the systems in place, and as you're making that transition, that would be more or less a smooth or not so smooth transition. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned some of that, loss of maybe some institutional knowledge, I suppose, with the loss of those individuals. So I'd like to kind of explore that a little bit in terms of the current systems, or how you've been able to sort of transition from whatever the prior state was into your new state, and with that loss of maybe some people who were retaining some of that knowledge, like just how have you been able to manage through that from a systems perspective to both identify where there are gaps and then sort of work to fill them in your processes?
Well, I think like any time you're losing people, you're trying to manage those risks and what the succession plan is going to be. So we have had opportunities where we've been able to move other people up into those positions from those former areas who would also have that kind of skill set or knowledge. We've brought a number of external people in and have had to obviously train them and get them ready to take on those roles. It doesn't happen overnight, obviously. I don't know. It's been extremely challenging. It seems like almost every week we're having some turnover of some kind, and we've been managing it. But it is a big concern, and the longer you know, the Ames project draws out and we don't get to that single system and really be able to move to a provincial kind of team, I think that's a bigger challenge for us.
And do you have, like, is part of the work development of sort of standard operating procedures, and what is the status of that? What is the status of that?
Yeah, so when we created the SHA, we determined, okay, which policies do we need in place right away on day one? Things like signing authorities, procurement policies, things like that. So we had those ready on day one. And then as we've progressed, we've looked at what our other policies and procedures are and which ones we can move to a provincial based. And those ones that don't necessarily align with the systems, we've still been able to move to some provincial based. And like I said, we've been working with the teams in terms of, okay, you may not be able to implement it in your system, but there's some manual workarounds that we can do to try to implement those. So there's a lot of education that happens in terms of all of our policies, all of our work standards. And like I said, just this past fiscal year, we developed that kind of compliance checklist that we're using. It lists all of our different provincial policies, work standards, directives, or whatever, and we go through that with our finance teams on a regular basis. Are you guys following this? It's not necessarily a full audit, obviously. We don't have the capacity to do that, but we're asking the questions, are you following this? Any concerns? Are you aware of any non-compliance with any of these policies? So that's kind of how we've been trying to manage without the AIM system or the single system at this point.
Just going back briefly to the sort of the loss of leadership, how many senior level or executive level vacancies or resignations have you had to address?
Are you talking just in
Ames?
finance area or overall?
Overall.
So, I think with the creation of the Saskatchewan Health Authority, obviously one of the objectives of that whole undertaking was to reduce administrative services across the health system. And so, what we had before was we had 12 health regions that each had separate accounting, financial systems, that sort of thing, as Robbie has outlined. And, I would describe it as maybe various levels of sophistication in terms of financial controls, knowledge, expertise, that sort of thing. At the beginning, the auditor went through previous recommendations in the report. We have been cited in the past, going back to 2005, for separation of duties in various health issues in various health regions. And so this isn't something new. And the objective, obviously, of the authority is establishing a single system where everybody's following a common set of standards, practices, and again with the AIM system, so that they're all integrated through one system, combining 12 disparate systems that have to be cobbled together now, and many more systems when you include all the scheduling, HR systems that exist. And so this was the plan, to bring this all together. Now, as we move through that, obviously there are certain positions in what would have been the former regional health authorities that, are no longer necessary, and or people perceive that in the future their position might be no longer needed. And so, they make choices, they move on, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, we expected, I think, some of these challenges as we move forward in terms of building the new authority and building this new system. And so the outcome, hopefully, when AIMS is in place, and we, to some extent, fully complete the reorganization of our health regions into the authority, because that was a pretty complicated undertaking, because it's not only administrative, it's clinical, it's everything. At the end of the day, we will have common systems, we will have common standards, that sort of thing. And, I think, one of the other overall objectives, as stated at the time that this was created, was to, return some money that we're spending on administrative services to the front lines. And so the objective was to, by not having 12 administrations and having one, to reduce some administrative costs.
Thank you for that sort of high-level response. I take your point and appreciate that kind of context. And I would also sort of add that, clearly I can appreciate that this amalgamation would have been an opportunity to draw on best practice and sort of reset in terms of how e-health performs its work and delivers service. But maybe I should be just a little more specific in my question as it relates to the loss of leadership and turnover that you mentioned, and ask it specifically of within the finance function and just within the last 2 years. I think maybe that's more pertinent to what we're talking about here today. Could I ask that question?
Sorry, I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is, in the past 2 years, what has been the rate or level of attrition from the leadership level in the finance function?
I wouldn't be able to answer that offhand. I'd have to find that information and bring it back.
Just on that point, thanks for the question. It seems that it's pertinent to the chapter. Thank you for the undertaking to get the information on that front back to the committee. That can be supplied to the clerk, and that'll be shared then with the committee. So thanks for that undertaking. Any other questions at this point, Ms. Ritchie?
Yes, thank you. I did have one final question. And given all that you've just provided, you do have a date of June 30th, 2022 for the completion of this recommendation. How confident are that you will be able to achieve that, and what might get in the way of that, and how will you also then cover off for any of those things that might derail it?
In terms of confidence, I think we're we're more confident now than we have been throughout the project, or throughout the Ames project. But with any kind of big IT project like this, I think there's always some risks and concerns still. You know, just this week we had an issue or a bug issue with one of the software pieces. We had a defect, so that slowed down some of our testing abilities. So I think there are some risks there, but we have a steering committee, which we have a project management office, which they do a daily look at our outstanding issues and our risks, and you know, we're always looking at mitigation plans, and then those are brought up to our executive steering committee, where we talk about the risks and what of our plans. So over the last 4 or 5 months, we've put a big push on in terms of identifying those major potential blockers and you know, how we might mitigate them. So software defects was one of them. Again, going back to people capacity has been a challenge on this project. One of the issues we have is, you know, we have certain expertise in some areas where they're trying to manage different parts of the project and they can't do it all at one time. And we haven't been able to bring in other expertise. So there are some capacity challenges there. But again, we've taken steps to bring in outside resources, bring in additional SHA resources or other health system partners. Our strategic partner Deloitte has brought in more resources throughout the project. So this whole project has been about identifying what those risks are, what could slow us down, and getting on top of them quickly and early before they do become a problem.
Follow-up question to that then, you know, as that proceeds, is the budget on track, or is there capacity? I mean, you say you're bringing in other additional resources. I'm wondering about the budget implications.
We have had to come back to government a few different times for some additional funding for this project.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for the responses and the work. Deputy Chair Young.
The system is extremely important as to the amount of data and the expanse of the data that it does contain. And though there's still work ongoing on it, how confident are you that the system would be protected if there was a cyber attack? And is there a backup system in place?
Actually, we would have to have our eHealth colleagues here to answer that because they will manage the data for the system, and so their security protocols, as they exist for clinical data, they have similar ones for administrative systems. So there are always backups. It's a question of whether you have immediate failover like you have with clinical systems, so that if the system goes down in Saskatoon, it's automatically, if Saskatoon got hit by a tornado, God forbid, or something, that it's automatically shifts to Regina. And so whether that exists or not, or will exist, I'm not sure. There will be backups for sure. And those are always stored off-site, that sort of thing. After the cyber attack in 2019, and losing track of my years, even though that was a pretty, it was a significant attack and a novel one because it hadn't been seen across industry before, the one thing that eHealth was able to do was to restore clinical data very quickly from backups. And so those exist. But again, there's that issue of immediate failover versus going to backup.
I would just add, we are, as part of the project plan and the different work streams, so finance, supply chain, human resources, we are building business continuity plans as well. So if a system does temporarily go down, we'll have some contingency plans in place in terms of how we'll
Would you like eHealth to report out with more specificity?
Or something at this point in time, yes.
So just, it was referenced that eHealth might be able to provide more specifics on this front. If you can just refer the question to eHealth, and if they're able to provide response to the member's question to the committee in the coming days, that would be appreciated. Mr. Nerline.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Ultimately, who's responsible, eHealth or SHA, or who, for a failure in the security or risk management system today?
Ultimately, eHealth is a Treasury Board crown. It's responsible to the Minister of Health, and so, obviously, eHealth, the management are responsible to the minister to make sure that we have security systems that are adequate to protect against outside vulnerabilities. There are certain, I think risks that are very, very hard. You can't protect against everything. Some of the most sophisticated systems in the world these days are being successfully hacked. And eHealth, I think, even though it did have an issue that led to the cyber attack, which was, a person opening an email, that at the end of the day, it did a very good job of containing the attack and worked closely with technology partners to suppress it and to actually disseminate information to other industries so they could prevent the same type of attack. So, a lot of security-related issues are issues that users make every day. It's not changing passwords, it's opening, clicking on suspicious emails or other things, right? And that's what caused this. And so really hard for an organization. We can educate on it, but it takes one person to kind of not get the memo and do something.
Not seeing any other questions at this point. I know we have lots more on our agenda. Good questions. Thanks for the responses. Thanks for undertaking to get some information back to committee members here as well, to the officials. What I would look for, we have a few new recommendations here that haven't been considered at this table before. With respect to Chapter 14, the first chapter before us here today, I would look for a recommendation that we concur and note progress. Anyone? Moved by Deputy Chair Young. All agreed? That's carried. Moving along to Chapter 12 of the 2019 report, Volume 2, I would look for a recommendation that we concur and note compliance for recommendations 1 and 2, moved by Mr. Nerline. All agreed? That's carried. And with respect to recommendation 3, I would look for a recommendation that we concur and note progress. Moved by Mr. Gowdy. All agreed? That's carried as well. With respect to the final two follow-up chapters, Chapter 12 and 11 of the 2020-2021 Volume 2 reports respectively, I would simply look for a motion that we conclude considerations. Mr. Nerline moves. All agreed? That's carried. Okay, we'll move along here this morning. I'll turn it back over to the provincial auditor, and we'll turn our attention to the 2018 report, Volume 2, Chapter 23.
Chapter 23 of our 2018 report, Volume 2, on pages 135 to 149, sets out the results of our audit of the processes that the Saskatchewan Health Authority had to analyze surgical biopsies efficiently at its Regina and Saskatoon labs. A surgical biopsy is a procedure that involves the surgical removal of tissue, often to determine whether a patient has cancer. This chapter includes 7 new recommendations. In May 2018, the authority reported backlogs in examining biopsies. It noted labs in Regina and Saskatoon had almost 3,000 biopsies awaiting examination. Long waits for healthcare services can contribute to declines in health and can impact the healthcare system overall. Increased wait times for the results of biopsies and diagnosis cause patient stress and anxiety. In addition, it delays treatment, which can mean the difference between life and death. We concluded that for the 12-month period ended July 15th, 2018, the Saskatchewan Health Authority had, except for the areas highlighted in our 7 recommendations, effective processes to analyze surgical biopsies efficiently in laboratories located in Regina and Saskatoon. In our first recommendation on page 140, we recommend that the Saskatchewan Health Authority assess the impact of the surgical biopsy labs receiving accreditation through different bodies. Each lab uses a different set of industry-recognized accreditation standards to show it has appropriate and suitable standards and processes for analyzing surgical biopsies. At July 2018, the authority had not determined whether the labs should continue to receive accreditation from different bodies. Each lab operates under a 5-year license issued by the Ministry of Health that requires each lab to participate in the Saskatchewan College of Physicians and Surgeons Laboratory Quality Assurance Program. Under this program, labs can choose recognized accreditation bodies to accredit the labs. The former Capel Regional Health Authority selected the College of American Pathologists to accredit the lab, Regina Lab. The former Saskatoon Regional Health Authority selected the Western Canada Diagnostic Accreditation Alliance to accredit the Saskatoon Lab. While the Saskatchewan College of Physicians and Surgeons recognizes both of these accreditation bodies, having the labs accredited by different bodies may result in unnecessary costs and variations in lab operation practices. In our second recommendation on page 141, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority enter into a written agreement with the Office of the Chief Coroner about surgical biopsy lab services it provides for forensic autopsies. Except for its relationship with the Office of the Chief Coroner, the labs have clearly assigned responsibility to staff for the various analysis stages of biopsies of tissue specimens, pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical stages. Each lab provides the Office of the Chief Coroner with support, including technical lab staff and access to equipment, supplies, and space for the forensic pathologists to conduct forensic autopsies. However, we found neither lab clearly set out responsibilities of technical staff with respect to handling requests for analysis of forensic autopsies relative to handling other requests for surgical biopsies. There was no written agreement with the Office of the Chief Coroner about support provided for forensic autopsies or the responsibilities of each party for the handling of these cases and related specimens. Not having a written agreement increases the risk of the authority and the Office of the Chief Coroner not having clear or common expectations and understanding of each party's responsibilities, obligations, and processes to resolve differing views, if any. In addition, lack of a written agreement may result in authority staff within labs making decisions about the handling and processing of requests for biopsy analysis inconsistent with the authority's expectations. This could cause scheduling conflicts for technical staff and delays in processing surgical biopsies. In our third recommendation on page 144, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority implement a consistent approach for prioritizing and issuing timely diagnosis reports for surgical biopsies. We found the Regina and Saskatoon labs have different target turnaround times for processing requests for analysis of surgical biopsies and issuing diagnosis reports. They also use differing approaches to prioritize those requests. In addition, the target turnaround times do not always align with good practices. Consistent with good practices, we found both the Saskatchewan lab and the Regina lab to some extent varied target turnaround times for processing and issuing diagnosis reports based on the assessment of both priority and the complexity of the biopsy. Unlike the Saskatoon lab, we found the Regina lab did not have documented prioritization classifications and associated target turnaround times for biopsy specimens. Lack of documented guidelines increases the risk that staff do not prioritize requests consistently. We also found that the target turnaround times for each lab were not always consistent with good practice. For example, the Saskatoon lab allowed more time than good practice for some of its turnaround time targets, for example, priority 3 specimens, and less time for others, for example, breast cancer biopsies. Inconsistent prioritization strategy for processing and analyzing specimens may result in some patients and healthcare providers having to wait longer for diagnosis results than others, resulting in delayed care for patients. Inconsistent turnaround times for processing and providing diagnosis results leads to providing patient care inconsistently across the province. In our fourth recommendation on page 145, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority assess the cost-benefit of electronically tracking the location of surgical biopsy specimens throughout the key stages of the lab analysis process. We found neither lab maintains information about surgical biopsy specimens in a manner that enables ready tracking of the location of a specimen throughout the entire analysis process. In addition, neither lab maintains information regarding the complexity of a case and the time taken to complete each key point of analysis. Good practice expects the labs would track information about the biopsy analysis process electronically to easily identify where a specimen is at in the analysis process. Collecting and maintaining information manually results in labs not being able to easily identify who has control of the specimen or determine how long each point of the process takes. For example, how long it takes lab technical staff to prepare the specimen for analysis. This can result in staff wasting time locating a specimen. Not having an adequate tracking system makes it labor-intensive for the labs to determine if their target turnaround times are reasonable and to determine reasons for not achieving them. In addition, it increases the risk of labs losing or misidentifying specimens in the process, which may result in labs providing untimely or inaccurate diagnosis results to healthcare providers and, in turn, their patients. In our fifth recommendation on page 147, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority formally assess the surgical biopsy process at its surgical biopsy labs to identify factors inhibiting timely diagnosis. We found the authority does not know why labs are not achieving turnaround targets or whether its labs are appropriately staffed. Neither lab tracks the number of surgical biopsy analysis requests by their complexity and priority or the time it takes to complete each tracking point in the biopsy analysis process. In addition, neither lab tracks workload of technical staff to evaluate the productivity of the work units. Our testing of 34 surgical biopsy requests and assessment of data compiled from each lab's IT system found neither lab is issuing patients' results timely. We found the Regina Lab's average for issuing diagnosis reports was 18.7 days in 2017-18, compared to its target turnaround time of 5 days. We also found one instance where the Saskatoon lab took 222 days to issue a diagnosis report. Neither lab had formally determined whether its target turnaround times were realistic or analyzed reasons for delays. By not meeting their turnaround time targets, the labs are putting patients' health at risk, as timely diagnosis is required to begin any required treatment. In our sixth recommendation on page 147, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority educate healthcare providers on properly completing surgical biopsy requisitions for Regina and Saskatoon labs. We found requisitions that each lab receives from healthcare providers are not always complete and/or the priority of the request is not always properly classified. Our testing of 34 requests found one instance where a requisition form was missing key information. This error on the requisition resulted in a delay of 44 business days in completing the diagnosis report for the patient. Incomplete requisition forms from healthcare providers can result in delays to diagnosing a patient's biopsy. Providing healthcare providers with training or better guidance on completing requisitions and when to identify a biopsy as urgent could help reduce the number of errors on requisitions received. In our seventh recommendation on page 149, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority require its labs to keep records of preventative maintenance completed by technical staff on its surgical biopsy equipment. We found the authority does not require the labs to track the completion of preventative maintenance. For all 10 pieces of equipment we reviewed at the Regina lab, The Regina Lab kept adequate records of maintenance completed, including records of who did the maintenance and when. However, for all 6 pieces of lab equipment we tested at the Saskatoon lab, the lab did not keep track of when its staff last performed preventative maintenance. Not documenting when preventative maintenance on surgical biopsy equipment is completed and by whom increases the risk of not completing maintenance as expected. Lab equipment must receive appropriate maintenance to ensure analysis is properly completed. I will now pause for the committee's consideration.
Thanks so much for the presentation and the really important focus of the work when you think about the impact on people and patients. I want to thank as well all those that work in the labs and all the pathologists that are working so hard and so dedicated to their service, so dedicated to patients every day. I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Hendricks for response, then open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you. So with respect to the auditor's recommendation on page 140, that the authority assess the impact of the surgical biopsy labs receiving accreditation through different bodies. The SHA considers this implemented. The Provincial Executive Committee for Laboratory Medicine has assessed the impact and approved the use of both the Western Canadian Diagnostic Accreditation Alliance and the College of American Pathologists to provide accreditation to ensure the SHA surgical biopsy labs meet the highest levels of quality. Basically, they consider them equivalent. The auditor's second recommendation on page 141, that the authority enter into written agreements with the Office of the Chief Coroner about surgical biopsy lab services it provides for forensic autopsies. The SHA considers this implemented. The SHA assigned a memorandum of understanding with the Office of the Chief Coroner, and that was completed and signed on December 14th, 2020. The third recommendation on page 144, that the authority implement a consistent approach for prioritizing and issuing timely diagnosis reports for surgical biopsies. The SHA considers this recommendation partially implemented. Provincial performance metrics have been established. Standardized turnaround times for data for Saskatoon and Regina are provided to the Executive Director of Lab Medicine, the Provincial Head Lab Medicine, and the VP and Executive Physician of Provincial Programs, as well as the Ministry of Health monthly. The Provincial Anatomic Pathology Discipline-Specific Working Group created a draft standard operating procedure that will be implemented to all 5 anatomic pathology labs following review and approval by the Anatomic Pathology Provincial Discipline-Specific Committee. The provincial standard operating procedure is expected to be reviewed by late February 2022, with implementation to follow thereafter. In terms of the fourth recommendation on page 145, that the authority assess the cost benefit of electronically tracking the location of surgical biopsy specimens throughout the key stages of the lab analysis process. The SHA considers this recommendation partially implemented. Saskatoon did implement a specimen tracking system in December 2018. An RFP for immunochemistry instrumentation was completed in June 2020, which included a specimen tracking system for Regina as well. With funding approved for the project, vendor installations were scheduled for the fall of 2021 for both Regina and Saskatoon. However, implementation was delayed due to COVID-19, and we're currently waiting for IT support from both eHealth to complete the server space and interfacing. For the fifth recommendation, that on page 147, that the authority formally assess the surgical biopsy process at its surgical biopsy labs to identify factors inhibiting timely diagnosis. The SHA considers this recommendation implemented. After a thorough review, constraints were identified that impact the turnaround time that inhibits timely diagnosis. The review identified the need for additional grossing workstations in Regina to assist with workflow. Renovations were completed and 3 new grossing stations were installed in Regina in February 2021. The sixth recommendation on page 147, that the authority educate healthcare providers on properly completing surgical biopsy requisitions for Regina and Saskatoon labs. The SHA considers this partially implemented, A provincial general surgical requisition was developed in consultation with stakeholders. The new form was approved by the Clinical Standards Forums Committee and made available for clinicians to use in the fall of 2021. The implementation plan and training package was to be discussed at the September 2021 quarterly meeting, which was postponed until late 2022. And then lastly, the seventh recommendation on page 149, that the authority requires labs to keep surgical records of preventative maintenance completed by technical staff on its surgical biopsy equipment. The SHA considers this recommendation implemented. Maintenance logs have always been in place, but were not consistently completed by staff in Saskatoon. Staff have been reminded to complete the logs, management reviews the maintenance logs weekly at a minimum to identify non-compliance in a timely manner. Management implemented this recommendation immediately after the audit. Thank you. That concludes our response.
Thanks for the report, and thanks for all the important work on these recommendations. I'll open it up to committee members for questions. Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I note that it's listed in the auditor's report that Saskatoon has an average of 12.1 days for biopsy diagnosis, and Regina an average of 18.7. I'm wondering what, those are the averages, but sort of what's the shortest or the longest that you've seen in terms of those turnaround times, and then what leads to these discrepancies between our two urban centers?
So Corey Miller, Vice President of Provincial Programs for the Saskatchewan Health Authority. To answer your question, in the range, there's a wide variance. We have some surgical reports that can get out the same day in a rapid response, and we have some greater than 50 days, and that can be for a number of reasons. And I would say for the short, it would be because it's a very urgent request and requirement for the surgery, for the surgeon who has requested it for that patient, and the same could be for the long wait. It would often, in those instances, we'd be waiting for a result to come back from out of country or out of province, where we might send for a secondary review to the Mayo Clinic would be an example. We have contracts with both. Mayo Clinic would be probably our main connection, but we send also for secondary review to Vancouver quite often as well.
I'd like to understand that a little bit better in terms of how common a practice that is, the kinds of diagnostics that have to go out of province versus in.
A great question. Pathology is becoming a more and more specialized service, so it's less generalized and more specialized. And that is why we're seeing more and more of our pathology services be centralized into Saskatoon and Regina and away from our rural sites. It's not because we're trying to centralize. It's difficult for us to recruit pathologists into a single practice because you don't have the ability to consult with a dermatology specialized or oncology specialized. So it's rare for us to have pathologists who want employment in a single or a double practice. They want to be in a group practice. No different than in a larger institution or a specialized institution like the Mayo Clinic. They may have people who are very specialized in genomics and genetics, hemopathology. So I would say we're sending less and less out of province, and the area that I would key on specifically is the areas of genomics and our hematopathologists, and we have a really great lab in Saskatchewan that a lot of people don't realize it, called the Advanced Diagnostic Research Lab, which is in the College of Medicine. They do fantastic work, and in the report it also says people refer some of their difficult cases to our teams as well, because we have some people in Saskatchewan who specialize in certain pathology services that they don't have any services. And that's not uncommon for Alberta and BC to send samples to us as well. Having that genomics lab in Saskatoon, if our colleagues from the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency were here, they would say that they're exponentially sending us more and more of that specialized service, because they used to send it out and it would take 3 to 4 weeks to get those results that they can get back now in 3 to 5 days. So there are some cases where we send out and it's a longer response. There are cases where we're able to now service them locally. And not all pathology cases are equal, nor is the process and the procedure to prepare the slides to be read by our specialists. So some slides can be prepared in an urgent manner, and there'll be a quick read, and then they send it through our processes where it's processed and reread. So it's not uncommon for there to be a preliminary read and then an amendment to the report that is then reissued to the surgeon or to the requesting clinician. So that does make the range very variable, because there are so many different types of procedures, as well as different types of pathology that our team is looking at.
So the auditor's recommendation in this example is ensure that, basically that you have a process, a consistent approach for prioritizing and issuing timely diagnostic reports. And I appreciate what you're saying in terms of, obviously complexity and due to the nature and the type of diagnostics, obviously things are going to need to look a little bit different. So in the SOP that's been produced for this process, maybe you could speak to kind of how it's accounting for those factors.
Of the recommendations from the provincial auditor that touch each other.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
The example that I would use with recommendation number 6 was around educating healthcare providers and having a standard requisition. So similar to the previous chapter that we reviewed, talking about amalgamating the health authority. Each health region had its own lab forms, and we're amalgamating them into a new common form. Having and educating our referring clinicians, it's not just physicians, clinicians, is very important, because if the pathologist in the back office doesn't see the patient, they don't meet the surgeon often, and it's important that they prioritize what are we looking for and how urgent is it. And if all we get is a piece of paper saying breast cancer, and it doesn't give us the specific type of breast cancer that there's suspicious of, there are different ways in which we prepare different specimens for different reasons. So I think it's important that we have a standard form. We agree very much with the provincial auditor. We agree that this will be ongoing. It's not specific just to laboratory. Many of our ordering services, the more information that our pathologists, radiologists can get from the ordering physician, the easier it is for us to then prioritize how quickly does this need to be seen. So the example I would give you is a lady with a stage 3 breast cancer is far more urgent than somebody where they're doing a scrape of some derm off of their skin in a family physician's office. That can wait. This needs to be prioritized and processed ahead of it. So that's where it's important for us. That requisition is an important piece, as well as our processes. So when the lab is receiving specimens, it's not just coming from the operating room, it's coming from the emergency room, it's coming from family physicians, it's coming from ambulatory care. So that intake process and that requisition, it's important that we have processes in place that allow our team to prioritize. This needs to go in the urgent today, tomorrow box. This can be in the Friday box. It's not as urgent. And when our pathologists are picking up the work that has been processed and ready to be read, it also needs to be in a prioritization so that they know these cases are more important than the other cases. Hence why I think there are 3 or 4 of these recommendations that touch each other. Having the ability to track and monitor where are these specimens in the process, because the process can take days, and in that time frame, the referring clinician may change the urgency, or they may be asking, I expected these results yesterday and I still haven't gotten them. To find the specimen can take hours without a tracking system, which then takes people off the line and furthers that tack time. And the experience that we've seen in Saskatoon, to Deputy Minister Hendricks's point, with the implementation of the tracking in Saskatoon has saved many, many hours a week of not just the pathologist, but the entire team that could be processing samples in the meantime. So we do have that system ready to be implemented in Regina. We just need to get it implemented with the IT support from both eHealth and our digital health. Hope that helps.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it must kind of remove a little bit of the chaos, I suppose, that might ensue otherwise when you've got a number of factors at play, whether it's the type of biopsy analysis work and whether that's in-house or needs to be sent out to province, and the urgency of a stage 3 versus something that's lesser criticality. I'm just, as you're talking, I'm appreciating just the vital nature of this of the work and the importance of having good systems in place and the value of the auditor's recommendations in achieving that end and your efforts at ensuring their implementation in a timely fashion and in the best way possible, given also the the amalgamation, and it's that's also underway at the same time. So I think that bears mentioning, particularly as we've seen the added challenges of a pandemic and patients who aren't necessarily presenting to their physicians in a timely manner, and I'm thinking of a friend of mine who went through a situation of a cancer diagnosis, which was identified too late in the process, and ultimately she passed away at Christmas time. So these are real important matters and considerations to ensure we have good process. So with that, I do want to kind of back up and go to a more sort of practical question around first of all, great to hear that we've got such a fantastic genomics lab at College of Medicine. I'm curious to know what sort of, and maybe I'm off script here, but it is kind of a line of questioning. What sort of service model are with, like, I assume they're with, if they're with the college or the University of Saskatchewan, like what that interaction is like and how that's achieved.
The Advanced Diagnostic Research Lab at the College of Medicine and the Saskatchewan Health Authority have a critical partnership. Many of our clinicians are also faculty members within the college. So specifically, the Advanced Research Lab is led by Dr. John Dakota, who's a hemopathologist. So a lot of the work, he designs tests, he designs some genomics tests, and there's a network across Canada because it's really complex work, that they share their tests that they designed. So Dr. Dakota might have designed 3 or 4 breast cancer tests that his colleagues in Vancouver haven't done. He shares those with them so they can run those tests. So what they specifically look for in that lab is genetic mutations. So when you hear more and more about customized drugs for people, you'll hear more and more in the years to come, and so will our colleagues at the ministry, around companion testing. So you have, if a patient has, I'll use breast cancer as an example, we're working quite closely right now with the new gynecological surgeons to design some new gynecological tests where they will do genomics testing on your cancer tumor before they administer your chemotherapy, because they know that this genetic mutation of cancer will work with this kind of chemotherapy, but not this kind. And when we're talking $50,000 doses of chemotherapy, the $2,000 or $3,000 genomic test, we would call that a companion test. You should be doing this test before you decide which chemotherapy to give. That's the type of work that's done at that lab. So, yeah, that's the type of work that's done there for many different tumor types and diseases.
And so, Mike, yeah, great. Thank you for that. That's exciting developments within the field for sure. You kind of touched on it in the early part of your answer, and I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit more, though, just in terms of what that service agreement is like between the college and the health authority.
I can't speak specifically to the service agreement that we have with them. The members that work within that lab are all members of the Department of Lab Medicine within the Saskatchewan Health Authority, and they do partner also. We are in the process of expanding that genomics testing at Roy Romano Provincial Lab with our partners at the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency, but it's preliminary right now. But so all of those physicians are also members of our department.
And as Corey mentioned, a number of them have joint appointments, and we fund them through the College of Medicine and through the Clinical Services Fund. And we do provide clinical funding for the Department of Pathology as well. So be it through the SHA or the Ministry of Health, that's how that is funded in Saskatoon.
And then I'm curious to ask, for those that are out of province, how does that work? Where specimens have to go out of province?
So, I mean, we do have agreements with certain labs for certain tests. Not all labs, as I pointed out, have capacity or specialists in certain areas, so that we do have agreements with the Mayo Clinic would be an example. BC Children's, we send some samples out there. I don't have the comprehensive list with me, but we do have arrangements where we do send specimens out of province and out of country.
And in the cases where samples go out of province, according to those agreements, can you explain how those priorities are set, and how do we ensure that we're getting where we're ending up in the queue, I suppose, and the response is back?
Yeah, I don't have the specifics on the process for how we end up in the queue. Certainly our clinicians recommend to our department that this sample, we would like to send it out of province to this specific lab for a second read or a second opinion. And then that is sent up through our lab leadership for approvals. And that is the process. Where after that, as far as where we go in the queue there, I would have to get that detail from our department.
And so then as it relates back to the operating procedures, how is that accounted for in those cases where it might be indeterminate, the time frame with which samples come back, and how that's tracked, monitored, ensured going forward?
So to just address the process and the procedures for sending samples out of province, in compared to the overall number of lab pathology surgical samples that we have in process, at any given time, the TAC number that we have in both Saskatoon and Regina is in around 750 a day. So that's how many would be in motion any day. So that would be whether they're just still in the Rubbermaid tubs, they almost look like lunch kits that are coming from the OR all the way to the pathologist's desk. At any given day, we have about 750 in process. Our long waiters are very small, and these are the ones that go out of province, but every sample is important, so I do take your question seriously. Just because it's a number of 1 or 3, that's still 1 or 3 patients. It's not, but they're relatively small numbers that we do send out of province for secondary reads, and I would also point out that is often done in consultation with the referring clinician, so that feedback and input can be given to the patients that know they are waiting. So the preliminary read, there can be a preliminary report that goes out to the surgeon. The surgeon is aware that the sample is being sent out. They can often act on it, but they still need to know what was that in order to ensure that they have definitive treatment plans, et cetera. As far as the operating procedure of how we fit into the samples being set out, I don't think I have anything specific to share with you on that today.
So, okay, so you're saying that, I guess when we began this sort of line of questioning, I kind of was left with the impression that samples were being sent out of province fairly, on some frequency, that's not insignificant, I'll say. I assume that, that might explain why we had samples taking as long as 222 days based on the sample that the auditors had taken. And now it sounds, I think I'm hearing something a little bit different, but I guess what I want to sort of ask next is, is it the case that, that with all that complexity and need in some cases to go out of province and the tracking process that's in place to ensure that things are moving forward in a timely manner and the right decisions are being made in terms of what's receiving priority in that list. I think, the audit recommendations are trying to address sort of process improvements there to ensure timely service. But I'm wondering are there, what other kinds of factors might be contributing to a longer turnaround time?
Case of the 222 days, but I do know that, the recommendations that the provincial auditors have made since the original audit, we do get our monthly report turnarounds sent to our executive team. We would have a flag if we're seeing something getting out to be 50 days, 60 days, 70 days. I'm looking at the November 21 and the longest wait out was 42 days. So to put that into perspective, that sample probably was processed and reviewed already in the Saskatoon or Regina lab, and then the decision was made to send out. Then it's sent out of province or out of country, processed there. So it could be on day 7, 8, 10, 12 before it's even sent out of the province. Then it's sent to the Mayo Clinic for their review. So that's why we would have a longer wait period like that. I think there's time to deliver, time to process, time to make the decision on sending it out of province. So I think those would be some of the delays that would add up into that 42 days. and it's not an electronic interface when we send things out. They do send the blocks back to us because we do have a responsibility to keep as much of the samples as possible. And then the report would come with that, and then we would interface that report into our system, which would give us that would be the complete, where it would no longer be in process.
I do have several more questions, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure kind of where we're at in terms of timing.
Well, no, the questions are important. It's a serious report. I'm just looking, that's wonderful. I want to make sure you're getting the, the questions in that are needed. Looking to other committee members, just if there's to break it up a bit, or are there anyone else that has a question right now, or should we kind of? I'll just ask one, just to give you a breather and a glass of water. Just with respect to the Regina Lab, it states that there's the assessment going on as to the factors that were causing some of the challenges around the timeliness of the reporting, and it said that the recommendation's been implemented, that the assessment was there was some needed equipment and renovations. Were there any other, which is wonderful that that's been addressed, were there any other factors that were identified there? Were resources a question? Were, the access to the professionals there, the pathologists, or the staff that are required? I can come your way if you want, and then.
So obviously, in any major operation like this, there's a number of factors, and there's always opportunities for improvement. And that's why we're always grateful for our outside eyes, like the provincial auditor, to come in any of our services to help us identify opportunities for improvement. It spoke specifically in our response to the renovation of the grossing room, and you can't look past the entire process in pathology, and the grossing room is exactly what it sounds like. It's a gross room. That's where the specimens are cut into pieces, and that's where the outside edges are taken off. And one of the factors that definitely contributes to wait times in the province is that around the grossing room and the people who work in the grossing room, which are called pathology assistants. We've struggled with pathology assistants for a number of years in our province, and when we're short there, it often means that the pathologists have to go in and do the prep work, where that they can do it, they're trained to do it, it's part of their training, but it's not the best use of their time because other people can do it. We have worked to train other people within our lab, so some of our senior lab techs are trained to do grossing work. It's not fun work, and not a lot of people like working in there. The Saskatchewan Health Authority, over the last year, we've entered into an agreement with the University of Calgary. They do have a training program for pathology assistants, and we have agreed to fund 4 pathology assistants to go to the University of Calgary for their practicum, and they will be doing their clinical practicums in both Saskatoon and Regina. So we have funded those students with return for work contracts. So we will pay for their training if they agree to come back for a return for service in both Saskatoon and Regina. And we're at that point now where those students are doing their practicum training in both Saskatoon and Regina, which will be of huge long-term benefit. So it's not adding to our pathology numbers, but it's allowing them to have more time available to be reading slides instead of preparing slides. So I think that's a major factor. We always do have churn in our pathology numbers, like any part of our business. We have approximately 55 FTEs for pathologists in Saskatchewan, and we currently have 47 of those filled. I know we have one coming who's already signed a contract. He's coming in July, and I know we have a number that are being site visited right now, but they're looking at more than one opportunity, so I'm not going to blow or shine extra light on it. We do have candidates that we are looking at, but I would say they're looking at us as well. So that's sort of where we're at from a recruitment perspective. But I think that that pathology, the work that we did in Regina to expand the grossing rooms as well as to renovate them was much needed and will improve the efficiencies in the Regina lab and have already. Thank you.
No, thanks for those responses, and thanks for the work around recruitment and as well the piece around the assistants, the pathology assistants. And I would want to say, if any of them are ever looking at the record here, just thanks to everyone involved in that work, all of the pathology assistants and all those pathologists and the expertise that we're so privileged to have in this province. Certainly, the report highlights, the continued needed focus on these fronts. Thanks for your comments. I know Deputy Chair Young has a question. We'll see if we burn through your questions. If not, you can do an audit, and we'll come back to you with the questions.
Mine are in regards to recommendation number 3 and recommendation number 6, both of them which are at this point supposedly partially implemented. And the one on the standard operating procedure for the lab services in the 5 different labs, as well as on number 6 with regards to the general surgical requisition form. Where are you at in rolling those out? And could you tell me why it would take till December to have everybody on board with making sure that those forms are done right?
Thank you for the question. So the form specifically, it's taking the 12 different health authorities and having our committee, so it's our provincial department, come together and decide on what is important and needs to be on the forms. Making it electronic, so it's both paper and electronic, so that it can be sent to us both ways, because the samples come to us sometimes from the community and sometimes from within our buildings. And then the standard operating procedures, it's the example that I'll use is, because I went there a little bit earlier, it's ensuring that all 5 of our hospitals that do lab have the same way in which we prioritize, so that in the future we can load level, and we do that often. If one lab is falling behind, we can move samples to another lab. So the example that the Provincial Auditor's Office pointed out was Regina having a big backlog, but let's say Moose Jaw doesn't. We could move simpler samples to Moose Jaw. When I say simpler, that ensuring that those physicians can read them. They have the competencies and experience to read them. So it's the standardized operating processes to ensure that we are ranking and evaluating things the same, so in all 5 of our pathology labs, so that they can be moved between, and what we say is an urgent in all 5 places, and it's not different in Moose Jaw, from North Battleford, from PA, Saskatoon, and Regina. But I understand your question, and I take it of why would it take so long to make that change. It's just the process that our team has to go through to implement change and to change processes that are instilled into their work every day.
So they wouldn't necessarily take a best practice and ensure that everyone just follows that same best practice regardless of where it's coming or going to?
I mean, I think best practice is instilled into the work that they're working to standardize.
See, Mr. Skorlpat has a question.
Actually, it's a follow-up to that. That was kind of where my head was. First, I want to say thank you for the work you do on this. I think, certainly speak for all folks here, that either directly or indirectly, I think most people in Saskatchewan have been touched by this and the work that the labs do here. So the timeliness is so important. Regarding the consistent forms and best practice, I guess a couple questions. One, would some of that best practice be driven then from the labs moving up, or from the physicians down?
I think a lot of the best practice comes from, and again, it's embedded in some of what we've spoken about today around the accreditation processes that we have to have our labs go through. And you heard today, the decision was made of the executive to actually follow both the Western Canadian accreditation as well as the American pathology. There's a lot of overlap, so I just want to be clear that the standard operating processes built into accreditation are rigorous. And when a lab says it has accreditation, it has a lot of standard operating procedures, which are best practice. That's why they're embedded into the accreditation standard. So, the fact that we have accredited labs, and the lab has made the decision to follow both, and some of that was because there were members of the department had strong feelings that we need to belong to the American college. There's some that felt like we needed to belong to a Canadian college or the Western Canadian college. So we made the decision we would have our labs meet both accreditation requirements. So it's extra effort, but I want to be clear that there's a lot of overlap, and best practices are instilled into the accreditation standard operating practices that are required in accreditation. So I hope that gives you some assurance in your question. We wouldn't be passing our lab accreditation if we weren't following best practices, which are embedded into those standard operating practices that are a requirement for accreditation.
I guess as a bit of a follow-up, just taking it a little bit further, you spoke how, and really educated us, how all the pieces have to work together, or certainly it creates delays in the process. So to that effect, I'm looking at the plan to educate physicians, surgeons to be able to fill out those forms in a consistent, accurate manner. And what kind of, I guess, what are you looking at to get everyone up to speed?
Obviously, when I spoke earlier about electronic forms, the value of an electronic process, an electronic form, it doesn't let you go by without marking, is this elective, urgent, emergent? So an electronic form would allow us, you can't just be sloppy and scribble something and expect that the person 5 steps down the chain can read your writing and understand and read into what is needed. The electronic form allows us to put rigor into it. So we can do that, though, also through manual process. It's going back to that person and saying, we can't process this until you fill it out right, and keep doing that and training them to do it correctly.
Questions? Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad someone brought up the.
We'll come back to, that'll be a good question too. Keep going, Ms. Ritchie.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to just this last line of questioning here, because I did find that a little bit interesting, the fact that, you guys decided at the end of the day to sort of keep both accreditation systems. I can appreciate how that would come about, but I'm wondering, though, in terms of what you were saying earlier about service loading and making those decisions, how does this impact on your ability to compare and prioritize if you're not necessarily dealing with an apples to apples comparison, or is that not the case?
I just need to be clear, our processes aren't completely different everywhere. Right? We do have the ability to move samples, and we move hundreds and hundreds, even probably thousands of samples between our labs every day in this province. Because we have the Roy Romano Provincial Lab here in Regina, which is a state-of-the-art laboratory. We're privileged to have such a tool for our patients, and we move and today we're talking about pathology specific, but we have chemistry, we have microbiology, we have all kinds of laboratory tests that happen, but today we're talking specifically about pathology. And I want to be clear, it's not a hodgepodge of different processes happening in all of our different labs. They're very similar, but what we're saying in lab terms is to have things standardized is to the 4th decibel within lab. The people are very specific, and we do have work to do. That's why I think our team said it's partially implemented. There is work to do to standardize our operating practices between our different laboratories, and some of that is because our setups are different. Our equipment is different. we are in the infancy of standardizing what our labs will look like. We don't have all the same equipment, we don't have all the same setups, and we'll be working that direction together as a provincial team in our new structure.
Appreciate that little bit of color and explanation. So when you're moving samples around from lab to lab across the province, do you have a service provider? How is that done?
Some aspects we do. We have contractors that are through procurement, but we do have different contracts in place that move our samples. Life Labs is an example. You see their labs around Regina and Saskatoon. They are one of our service providers that move samples from our community collection sites too. We do work with Robbie's team in procurement that have contracts with many courier companies that move samples from small town to the larger labs or between the major labs. And we certainly saw a great deal of that happen through COVID. We were moving thousands of samples every day from around the province to both the Roy Romano Provincial Lab as well as the Royal University Lab. So yeah, we have a number of different contractors who provide transportation of our samples.
Is it possible to track those costs through the accounting process? I'm just wondering. If memory serves, my vague understanding was that some of those services previously might have been provided by the former STC.
Some of the samples would have come through STC, no question, over the years. But we obviously, the show needs to go on, so we've procured couriers who do that work. We pay those vendors for that service so we could track and monitor the cost of transportation. It's a big part of our lab service, transportation of the supplies to where they need to be processed.
Right. So I'm just wondering, is it possible to be provided with some of that information in terms of the costs? I know I'm a little bit off track here, but it opens up just an interest. I'm kind of curious to know, the costs involved to perform that function over the years.
Yeah, we at the time the decision was made around STC, we did actually receive some questions at committee about some of the transportation costs. And if my recollection is correct, I think it was mostly actually CBS on blood products that was using STC. But we can dig up that information and provide it to the committee. I don't have it handy, and quite honestly, that's too long ago.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask.
Thanks for that. Just like any other undertaking, the information you can provide it back to our committee clerk, and they'll share it out.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to some of these more pertinent audit findings here. I've just got one last little line of questioning to go through, Mr. Chair. So what is the current backlog in assessments?
I don't have the current backlog number on me today.
Yeah, we don't have the current backlog number, but we can speak to the average time, which would be comparable to what the auditor had reported. And if you're interested in that information.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Is that something you could provide in the course of this discussion right now?
I mean, so Corey had mentioned earlier that, the most recent data he was looking at was from November of 2021. And so at that point, the average time for cases that were signed out of the Saskatoon lab was 7 days, 9 hours. and comparing that to, I think the auditor's finding was in the 12-day range. Regina was 5 days, 16 hours, which is significantly reduced from the 18 days, 7 hours time frame. So the changes, that Corey has described, particularly in Regina, which was seeing much higher wait times for processing samples, has really decreased significantly to that point in November of 21.
And so on page 142, there's a number of good practices suggested for diagnostic timelines. Are these consistent with what's in place to date?
Urgency, so urgent biopsies within 24 hours, small biopsies within 3 hours. Yeah, I have to get a report back on how our current wait times are in these urgency classifications for those specific disease types.
And then I guess I would have a question for the auditor. Is it in the opinion of the auditor that the variance in practice between Regina and Saskatoon is leading to inequitable patient outcomes and standards?
So I guess in terms of what we did recommend was, you're right, developing some sort of consistent approach. From our perspective, when we did the audit, we felt like 5 business days was almost what, and we would have been consulting an expert during the course of our work as well, was almost what a routine biopsy should take in terms of completion and diagnosis. And so a more complex case could take, as Corey indicated, up to sort of 15 business days. So hearing that to some degree, Regina and Saskatoon are closer, whereby they're, it's 7 and 5 now, is good to hear. We will be following up on the recommendations we have made. I believe we anticipate doing that work this coming fall, or for sure by the spring. So we will be circling back to these recommendations, and then obviously providing a report back to the committee in terms of the status of these recommendations and whether we do agree and concur that they have been implemented to date. So thank you for that.
Then on page 145, there is a mention of a cost-benefit tracking system. Sorry, I'm just going from my notes. Is this something that can be provided? Am I understanding that correctly?
I think we spoke of the tracking system a little bit earlier, where we have implemented one in Saskatoon, and we have procured one for Regina through another procurement process. It just hasn't been implemented yet, and a little bit just on the backlog of IT implementations, some of that due to COVID. But we do have that system procured, and certainly that specimen tracking system will be a benefit for the overall turnaround, as we spoke about a little bit earlier.
Okay, and I'm just wondering, is there examples, and maybe this is a question back to the auditor, if there were examples in other jurisdictions that were considered, just to get an idea of what the expectations were in terms of what it would look like?
So if you're talking about the electronic tracking system, we never like to tell any agency that you must purchase. So hence why we said you analyze, make sure from that cost benefit side that this would make sense. We were aware at the time of the audit that Saskatoon had received some funding at that time and was probably going to be pursuing that alternative, which was a good thing, because as you indicated during the course of our work with the independent consultant that was utilized, having a tracking system that barcodes the sample so that you very much know where that sample is during the stage of the, I guess, during the analysis is a good thing. So it doesn't get misplaced, it doesn't have to be found, it doesn't take hours to round it up. So happy to hear, I guess, at the end of the day that Regina and Saskatoon have now implemented such a system. And I think it allows you to do a better analysis to figure out those different stages of the process of almost the biopsy, to figure out, is there any delays or gaps as such that we need to address?
I do think it's important to understand that our laboratory information system itself is a bit of a tracking system as well. The tracking system that the provincial auditor talked about is even a more detailed tracking system where it will track where it is in the process, but the provincial laboratory systems that we have are great. So the example I could give you is surgery could call us to say, where is my sample? And we can tell them, we've never received it. You didn't bring it to us because it hasn't been received in the lab. So when a specimen, whether it's pathology or anything, is received in the lab, it is entered into the lab information system. So we know it's in the system. We are still struggling similar to what Robbie spoke of earlier, with many different systems and at different levels. So we do spend an enormous amount of time entering data into our system. So a system might be collected in Nipawin, entered into the Nipawin lab system. When it's received at RRPL, it has to be entered into their lab system. And we do have a project underway with our partners at eHealth to standardize us to one provincial lab system. But we do have many FTEs every day that are re-entering data that has already been entered. And that's just part of our transition to a single entity, and we'll get there. We do have a project plan, and I'm confident that will make our laboratories far more efficient in the province of Saskatchewan.
Good to hear on that front. I mean, obviously, anything that can optimize the work of frontline workers and ensuring that they can do their work more effectively, efficiently. We all benefit from that. And I guess I'm kind of imagining, like a UPS where you can, jump in and track your package with a barcode number and that sort of thing. So yes, certainly that kind of technology exists. So you mentioned that Saskatoon has such a system already, but Regina was in the process. And so just some questions there around, has that budgetary allocation been approved, and where is it in the process?
As it was part of a procurement process that we had for immunohistology, so the funding was in place, the purchase has been made. We're now waiting for the system to be implemented. And whenever you implement a system like that, there's multiple integrations, and that needs to happen. And there's an IT project waiting for that to happen. There's been tremendous benefit of efficiencies in Saskatoon, and we are grateful for the support that we received from the City Hospital Foundation for that donation that they made to prioritize that for us.
When you say there's been an IT project identified for that implementation, has it been, is it also sort of in the queue, or does it have to wait for a new budgetary or? Okay.
Yeah, it's in the queue. We're just waiting for those resources to be available. When I say resources, it's just the IT infrastructure ready to help us with that implementation.
Thanks for that clarity and that response as well. I know Mr. Gowdy had a question I want to move over to.
Sorry. First of all, Corey, the way that you answer, we're loving it. Honestly, the way you can almost sort of see what goes on in the background. Appreciate that. Just seemed like the bottleneck you'd mentioned in the grossing room there. Is that sort of one of the main bottlenecks in the whole process?
I mean, it has been one of our bottlenecks because we've had to redeploy pathologists to be working in the lab. In the grossing area, we've used both technologists and lab assistants in that, and the pathologists don't particularly like working in the grossing room either, so it's not necessarily something that they long to do. And when we're short there, we can't have 4 pathologists waiting for samples and nobody processing them. So, they do step up and go in there as needed, but it isn't something their career longs to do.
It seems like Alberta's the training place for how many, you said we have 5 seats, or,
4 seats.
and how long is that program?
It's a 2-year program. They will be, so it's a postgraduate program, so it's a master's degree program. So those candidates, we had them come to our sites because we didn't want to train them and then they leave. It's one thing we're giving them a return for service, but they have to like where they're going to work at. So we had them both to Saskatoon and Regina for site visits, no different than recruiting a physician, to make sure they and their family wanted to stay in the city. They liked the facilities they were going to be working in, and we're confident that the candidates that we have accepted into the program will want to and will stay in both Saskatoon and Regina.
I just want to say, for MLAs, it's just so nice to be able to confidently say to people when they phone, we're waiting for my grandma or my father is in the hospital. To honestly be able to sit in here and be able to say, we do know where there are some bottlenecks. We do know, to be able to say that the kind of work you're doing to make things more efficiently and cutting costs and all you're doing, we just really appreciate that. And it's a privilege for us to sit in this room and hear.
Thank you for saying that. I think one comment that I would share with all of you, no different, my phone rings too because people know you're the healthcare guy. One tremendous benefit of COVID has been we have over 400,000 people who have signed up for My Sask Health Record, and your lab results, your pathology results are on there. And we talked today about the system's weights. Sometimes the weights are not the system, it's our partners. So, no news is not good news. I would say that to any patient. No news is not good news. If you haven't heard, phone, because the results might be sitting there for 25 days before you're given those results. Your physician is a business, right? And that business might not be calling you because there might be a stack of papers on their desk that high that they have to phone all of those patients. So now with the My Sask Health Record, that has empowered patients to look at their results and get timely information on their health care. And that's been a benefit of COVID. So that's a powerful thing, putting information to the patients.
And again, just thank you so much for all the work on this front and to all those involved in that work in the labs and the commitment to the further improvements. With respect to Chapter 23, I'd look for a motion that we concur and note compliance with recommendations 1, 2, 5, and 7, moved by Deputy Chair Young. All agreed? That's carried. Moving along to recommendations 3, 4, and 6, I would look for a recommendation to concur and note progress. Mr. Skoropat has moved. All agreed? That's carried as well. We will now turn our attention to another really important chapter, and that's Chapter 24 of the 2018 Report Volume 2, and I'll kick it over to the Provincial Auditor.
Chapter 24 of our 2018 Report Volume 2 on pages 151 to 167 reports the results of our audit of the processes that the Saskatchewan Health Authority used to prevent and control hospital-acquired infections in the Regina General Hospital and Pasqua Hospital. This chapter includes 4 new recommendations. A hospital-acquired infection is an infection that a patient acquires while in a hospital that was not present or incubating on admission. Such infections can extend a patient's hospital stay and may lead to increased complications and costs for treatment. In the most serious cases, hospital-acquired infections can cause or contribute to the death of a patient. We concluded that for the 12-month period ended August 31st, 2018, the Saskatchewan Health Authority had, other than the areas highlighted in our 4 recommendations, effective processes to prevent and control hospital-acquired infections in the Regina General Hospital and Pasqua Hospital. In our first recommendation on page 158, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority give hospital staff responsible for patient care formal training updates on infection prevention and control practices at least annually. The authority gives new staff that provide patient care in the Regina General and Pasqua Hospitals infection prevention and control orientation training. However, contrary to good practices, it does not provide them with formal, periodic refresher training on infection prevention and control practices. Infection and Prevention Control Canada recommends providing staff with education on infection prevention and control at least annually. We found new staff at the Regina General and Pasco hospitals receive about a 1-hour orientation shortly after they start work that sufficiently covers key aspects of infection prevention and control. However, the authority does not require staff at the Regina General and Pasco hospitals to receive refresher training on infection prevention and control. During the audit, we observed 15 units in the 2 hospitals and found staff did not always follow good practice for general cleaning, such as clean linen carts were not always covered or were in close proximity to garbage cans and soiled linen. Our observations suggest additional reminders to staff to follow good practices for infection prevention and control may be warranted. Periodic refresher training helps keep staff up to date and provides an opportunity to reinforce the importance of key activities to prevent and control hospital-acquired infections. Not having periodic refresher training can lead to inappropriate practices that may increase the risk of infection transmission and compromise the wellness and health of patients and staff. In our second recommendation on page 161, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority use external observers to conduct regular blind direct observation hand hygiene compliance audits in its hospitals. While the authority routinely monitors staff compliance with established infection prevention and control practices, it needs to do more. Management in Environmental Services, or housekeeping, completed regular audits to determine whether staff followed established cleaning standards. We observed that the Environmental Services Unit keeps track of its daily audits and immediately addresses identified deficiencies in cleaning. Hand hygiene is one of the main ways to prevent and control the spread of infections. Audits determine whether staff use appropriate hand hygiene practices. In blind audits, staff observe a unit staff's compliance with the hand hygiene policy when they are unaware of being observed. In direct observation audits, staff openly observe other staff's compliance with the hand hygiene policy. Consistent with good practice, the Ministry of Health guidelines for hand hygiene indicate staff external to a unit or facility should observe compliance with hand hygiene to decrease the potential for bias. However, we found the Regina hospitals do not complete blind audits of hand hygiene on a regular basis or use staff external to the unit for direct observation audits. The department did one series of blind audits during our audit period and found significantly lower compliance rates than those of their direct observation audits. Some units had a 60 to 70% difference, suggesting that actual compliance rates for hand hygiene may be significantly lower than the reported during the monthly direct observation audits. Not routinely conducting blind audits of hand hygiene or using staff external to units to observe compliance with hand hygiene practices increases the risk that compliance rates may not be representative of day-to-day hand hygiene practices. Not having accurate compliance rates may increase the risk of the authority not taking sufficient or timely action to improve hand hygiene practices of staff. This in turn places patients and staff at greater risk of hospital-acquired infections. In our third recommendation on page 163, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority actively monitor actions taken by Regina Hospital's patient care units with lower than acceptable hand hygiene compliance rates. The authority does not actively oversee the implementation of hand hygiene corrective action plans for units with low compliance rates to ensure staff improve hand hygiene practices. Not all patient care unit managers are doing enough to improve hand hygiene practices. Management expects unit managers to post monthly hand hygiene compliance rates on the unit's visibility wall to remind staff of the importance of hand hygiene. During daily wall walks, managers are to remind staff about hand hygiene and reinforce compliance. Also, when compliance rates are low, unit managers are to develop and post corrective action plans on their unit walls. For 4 of the 15 patient care units we observed, The hand hygiene compliance rates were not posted on the visibility wall. The average compliant rates for those units between April and June 2018 ranged from 43% to 87%. For 4 of the 8 patient care units we observed with compliance rates below 90% in August 2018, none of them had developed corrective action plans. We found that the authority was not actively holding patient care units accountable for the results of hand hygiene audits. We noted that the Infection Prevention and Control Department did not have authority to ask units whose compliance rates remained below target over a longer period to make improvements. We further noted hospital management was not actively overseeing whether their units developed or implemented corrective plans or improved hand hygiene practices as expected. Without posting hand hygiene audit results and corrective action plans, unit managers may not actively reinforce the importance of good hand hygiene practices or take sufficient steps to improve hand hygiene activities of staff in their unit. Not actively holding patient care units with unacceptable hand hygiene compliance rates accountable increases the risk of not taking timely corrective actions and places patients and staff at increased risk of hospital-acquired infections. In our 4th recommendation on page 166, we recommend the Saskatchewan Health Authority regularly give senior management a written analysis of emerging risks and causes based on trends of hospital-acquired infections. We found active monitoring of infection rates were reduced during reorganization of the authority's infection prevention and control departments. Analysis of trends in the Regina hospitals and emerging risks and causes of hospital-acquired infections is limited. While the Infection Prevention and Control Department continues to compare infection rates to its internal historical data to identify trends, since February 2018, neither it nor the authority formally analyzed trends or determined root causes for changes and reported on them. In addition, reports on hospital-acquired infections did not identify the types of patients affected, potential causes of trends, or outline actions to reduce infection rates. Also, they did not link locations of incidents of hospital-acquired infections to the hand hygiene compliance rates of those units. Without routine analysis of infection trends and linkage to results of audits of infection prevention and control practices, the authority may not sufficiently protect staff and patients from infections acquired in its facilities. The authority may also miss identifying opportunities for improvement at the hospitals and units therein with higher than normal rates of hospital-acquired infection. I will now pause for the committee's consideration.
Thanks for the presentation and the real important focus on this work. We know how important this is to people. I'll turn it over to the Deputy Minister to respond, then open it up for questions.
With the auditor's first recommendation on page 158, that the authority give hospital staff responsible for patient care formal training updates on infection prevention and control practices at least annually. The SHA considers this partially implemented. The development of a provincially standardized infection and prevention control training and education for onboarding and orientation has now been completed. An annual infection prevention and control education module is now online and available for all SHA staff. Once the Administrative Information Management System, AIMS, is implemented, steps will be initiated to make this training mandatory for all staff with managers tracking completion. The second recommendation on page 161, the authority use external observers to conduct regular blind direct observation of hand hygiene compliance audits in its hospitals. The SHA also considers this recommendation partially completed. The SHA approved hand hygiene policy in 2020 and implemented a standard hand hygiene auditing program in the former Regina Capel Health Region that includes blind audits. Beginning January 2022, employees in Regina will trial a new hand hygiene audit platform that, if successful, is intended to be implemented across the SHA. This new platform will utilize direct observation by auditors, with all efforts made to conduct direct observations as blind as possible. Recommendation number 3 on page 163, that the authority actively monitor actions taken by Regina Hospital's patient care units with lower than acceptable hand hygiene compliance rates. Again, the SHA considers this recommendation partially implemented. Leaders in the former Regina Capel Health Region were reminded to continue hand hygiene auditing, reporting, and improvement initiatives. The hand hygiene policy was approved as described above and includes accountabilities and reporting. Hand hygiene continues to be strongly emphasized during the COVID-19 response. The accountability and reporting structure within the policy includes measures and mechanisms for continuous improvement, and as part of the trial of the new hand hygiene platform, compliance with the provincial hand hygiene policy will be monitored and managed accordingly. And the last recommendation on page 166, that the authority regularly give senior management a written analysis of emergency risks and causes based on trends of hospital-acquired infections. The SHA considers this implemented. The infection prevention and control epidemiologist is providing quarterly updates on trends and the risks associated with transmissions to the Director of Infection Prevention and Control, as well as the regional medical microbiologist. The report highlights emerging risks and causes based on data trends. Areas of concern that have been shared with the executive directors for the clinical and support services in Regina, as well as those related to provincial oversight, and these are addressed as appropriate. So with that concludes our response.
Thanks for the response, and I'll open it up to committee members for questions. Certainly this is important stuff. Looking to committee members, Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Audit Department and Deputy Minister Hendricks for that update on status of the recommendations. I find this fascinating area. We're clearly way outside my area of expertise. So that's partly why I have a fascination. It's something I'm completely unfamiliar with, but obviously it's something that we can have an appreciation of as any member of society who's had a loved one who's undergone a surgery and experienced complications resulting from an infection post-surgery. And so the importance of this isn't lost on me either. And eager to sort of delve into the subject matter. And yeah, so I've just got sort of a high-level question to maybe start out with in terms of it would appear to me that this is a bit of a cultural issue when you have something that I would assume would be just like basic standard operating practice within a hospital setting, that and it's sort of almost like job number one. It's like safety. You're making sure that you are taking all those necessary precautions within a hospital setting to control infection and provide an environment that's free from infection as best you can, all things considered, of course. And that would be necessarily on the radar of all employees that work within a hospital setting, regardless of their performing surgeries or patient care post-op or the environmental services, I believe that's what they're called, something like that, right? And the vital work that they do in terms of, the cleaning and ensuring that, we're preventing infection. So none of that's lost on me, for sure. And I appreciate how critically important it is. So, so given all of that, and the need for strong adherence and compliance to systems and processes that will ensure an environment free from as much infection as possible, can you speak to, I don't know, it's a hard question to answer. I want to say that right from the get-go, but there is a cultural component to this. So could you please explain to me how that is addressed as part of the work, broadly speaking, and that as part of the infection and control detection group?
Sorry, okay. I'll keep my fingers off the button.
Thanks so much for joining us at the table.
Sorry, yes. I'm Beth Vachon, VP for Quality, Safety and Strategy with the SHA. So you're right, that's a really big question around the cultural issues of this, and it seems really simple that we just always wash our hands, but we know that when we do audits that we don't always either it's not observed, it doesn't happen in the way that we know is the safest way to do it. So when we talk about the cultural issue, I do have to say that going through a pandemic, I think, has really shone a spotlight on the need for good infection prevention and control and different sort of measures. So not only, donning and doffing properly our PPE, but hand washing being a really significant part of what we do to keep people safe. So I actually see that there is more attention now to hand hygiene, infection control, more so than probably at any other time in the past number of years. So that might be part of the culture change that we need to move forward. You can go into any room in a healthcare facility and there's reminders to wash your hands. When we design new buildings, we're making sure that hand wash stations are in the proper places, that we've got enough of them. So, as time has gone on, I think that there's a number of things that will help to shift the culture when we talk about things like, good hand hygiene. Making it easy for people to do the right thing, too, is also, I think, a big part of that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can see that, the pandemic really would have put a spotlight on it. However, there was SARS prior to COVID, and maybe there's a bit of time in there between that, things that kind of change a little bit. So it's not that there haven't been these previous opportunities for lessons to be learned and improvements to be made. So all to the good, of course, now. And maybe as you're talking about how there is more attention, can you speak to sort of current outcomes, results in terms of where you're seeing those improvements in the ways that you're tracking them? I've always got a little bit of a follow-up. My apologies. Because I think it's going right to the fourth, I think the last recommendation, because you do talk there about okay, so yeah, so you haven't done, okay, so you're still in the process of implementing that final recommendation on sort of the tracking and monitoring emergent risks, correct? So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the status of that.
the recommendation on page 166.
I believe so, yes. Yeah, I appreciate that it's in implementation, and okay, so twofold question. First of all, since the time of the audit, what improvements or in terms of measured outcomes are you seeing, and where are you at in the implementation of that recommendation?
One of the things that we've standardized is how we're testing people for things like VRE, MRSA, some of the antibiotic-resistant infections that we see, which we know cause significant harm to some people. So we've started doing some testing in Saskatoon and Regina, where we're only testing people when they come in high-risk situations, because what we know is that people who are, cancer patients are in ICU. Those are our most vulnerable, and those are the people that are often impacted most significantly by things like antimicrobial, resistant microorganisms. And so how we've started to do that is when we look at units like oncology, for example, ICU, we do see like a significant number, but we're testing and doing that screening on admissions so that people may be coming in with it, and we know that they're, so that we can take the proper precautions to be able to isolate, do all of the right gowning, doffing, infection control practices. So when we look at this, sometimes the numbers might look significantly high on a particular unit. It's because we're actually testing and screening for that, where we wouldn't do that on a general medical ward or, other units where we don't have the same level of risk and vulnerability of the patients.
Okay, and so how does that then, how does the hospital adjust, though, for some of the things that are identified in this audit in terms of hand hygiene and observations and those sorts of things?
Max had noted that we are starting we're testing a program right now. And I think part of our challenge has always been coming together, bringing 12 health regions into one authority, is again, how people have been collecting data, how that gets translated is part of that. So in Regina, starting in January, we're doing a 3-month trial on a hand hygiene audit program. If it meets the needs that we have, then we will implement that throughout the whole province. The key to that is that we can start to compare, numbers between different facilities. We can determine things like, what's that epidemiology, what's causing it, how do we start to link hospital-based infections with hand hygiene practices. So part of the challenge when you're doing everything manually is being able to track, trend, link, and then use that as an education tool as well to help change that culture of good infection control.
In terms of the resources within the infection prevention control, is that like a division that operates right across this kind of system-wide, and are those dedicated positions? If so, how many of them, and how has that changed over the past few years?
We saw some pretty significant inconsistencies in how, infection practitioner staff were hired throughout different organizations within the health sector prior to. So we do have in Regina, I'll speak to Regina because that's what the audit is requesting information on. Currently, we have 9.5 FTE infection control practitioners in the former Regina Capel. Along with this, we also have at a provincial level, a manager and admin support, and then 2 positions that provide that provincial level support. And that's an epidemiologist and a provincial infection control coordinator who, again, ensures things like standardizations, consistent practice, education. So delivered locally at the local level, but provincial support to ensure, again, that consistency and standardization.
And so I noticed that it said online modules were being developed. And so I'm just wondering about, when you talk about a manager that is responsible for the oversight of these frontline healthcare workers and overseeing infection control, how that's actually delivered, because I mean, obviously you can do an online module, but I'm wondering what sort of the managerial human component is to that, to ensure, that the learning is occurring, that the behaviors are being adopted, you're seeing the outcomes that you want in terms of, conformance and performance and eventual outcomes. How is that going to be achieved?
So many of the education programs that we have that are online, and we've had to move to that, for the most part over the last 2 years, they all have a component, a test component. So you do the module, you go in, you do the test. If you get even one thing wrong, it takes you back and, you re-review, and then you go back and complete the test again. So that's one way. The other thing that we've been doing, significant resources have gone into other ways of interacting with people and really stressing the importance, doing the education. And I'll say in the beginning, it was that real focus again back on PPE, proper use of personal protective equipment. So ensuring that people knew how to safely, don the PPE, safely take it off. And one of the probably the most effective ways to do that is staff members watch, their colleague put it on, take it off safely, and they kind of watch each other's backs to make sure that that's happening. So that's one really effective way. It's peers, peers helping peers. The other thing that we've done are things like town halls, where we open up a WebEx to all staff. Anybody can participate. They have the opportunity to ask questions. If we need to get back to them, there's personal interaction that goes back. We have newsletters. So we have daily rounds within the SHA, and every single day, everybody in their inbox gets whatever new resource material. It provides the link. So if there's something you have a interest in or a need to know, you click on the link and it takes you directly to the resource material. So that's been really effective. And then we also have leader resources, which is for out-of-scope staff. So it provides, coaching tips, tools, all of those kinds of things. And then the other thing that is published on a regular basis are things like safety bulletins, safety talks, huddle talks. So we have cascading huddles that have been implemented within the SHA, literally from the frontline huddle reports up to the CEO, and then we're able to escalate anything that hasn't been able to be solved at the appropriate level within the organization, so a way to remove barriers. That happens every single day within the SHA. Safety is a big component of that, so if there are issues, we do have that ability daily to be able to really focus in, remove the barriers, which is, that's a leader's responsibility to be able to do that, and then go from there. So those are a few examples of some of the ways that we're trying to address safety, culture, create information, and the ability for our staff to be able to be safe on the job and ensure that our patients are safe.
So for, are you tracking, I guess I'm wondering about sort of how that is playing out in terms of, like, are you seeing that there's certain areas or departments where you're experiencing lower levels of conformance with hygiene practices, the hand washing and that, versus other departments? So, for example, custodial staff versus nurses, pardon me. And if you could just sort of maybe explain how that might be addressed?
For the entire SHA, what that would look like. What I will say, though, is that hand hygiene audits, for example, are collected manually at the unit level or the department level, which is why we're looking at more of an automated program to be able to track and report on those things exactly. I would say at this point we don't have the ability to look at the entire SHA with that information because it all has to be compiled manually, but that really is the goal of implementing this new system, is to be able to report effectively trends, comparisons, all of those things. So the trial for that program completes the end of March, and then we'll make the decision that it's either meeting our needs or not, and from there I think we'll be able to provide better information.
For doing that, I mean, are there like feedback mechanisms from frontline employees in terms of, like, well, the reason why there is this non-conformance is because of this reason, or, how do you account for some of the, practical challenges, constraints, and if so, maybe some examples of what those look like? That's part of the process.
Are you're saying, like, do we solicit formal feedback from providers about?
Formal feedback from frontline employees.
On the audit process or on just generally on?
On conformance, like
Okay.
Are you getting feedback in terms of what might be getting practically in the way of the hygiene process and that?
So one of the ways that we would seek feedback is that when an audit is completed and those numbers are taken to the huddle or put on the wall, when they do their wall walks, that would certainly be an opportunity for feedback on what does staff think is the root cause? Is there something they need to dig in further? Is there, other information? And so, audit is a really effective way to be able to show the numbers and to start those conversations. So that is one of the ways that we would do that, is to have those discussions at the safety huddles in the morning to talk about, how do we improve these rates. Often, you'll see the run charts so that people can start to compare month to month if things are improving, getting worse, what's working, what's not. And then, so when you say formal feedback, I'm not sure if that is what you meant, but that would be the types of ways that we would seek that feedback from staff.
Just one final question. I know we're wrapping up here before lunch, but and thank you for your responses thus far. if I misspoke, I apologize. It wasn't necessarily formal, but just, what processes and how are you interacting to get the feedback? And, that's great what you're talking about in terms of, the daily walks and so on and so forth. And so so the follow-up question to that is, what are you hearing from those discussions? What might be the things from what you've heard that might be getting in the way of conformance?
I think there's lots of different levels and many different things that, yes. So it might be, again,